Hey everybody, this is my discussion wrap-up post. I would encourage you to do a PowerPoint or something for your discussion wrap-up if you are the discussion leader, just because yours is a little longer, so it will make it easier to follow. You do not need to give sort of critical pointers like I'm doing now on this first slide in terms of like telling people what you think they didn't do well enough. If anything, what I'd like to see you all do is just sort of talk positive, so if somebody made a good point, point that out. If you see some good themes, point that out. Sure, if you see like consistent in what you think are some, confusions, it's good to point those out. But I wanted to say a couple of things just as tips going forward here. So the first thing I noticed in a lot of posts is that people sometimes, the first two discussion questions I asked are not meant to be, they're meant to be questions where I'm asking you to think like, what is Lao Tzu saying? What do you think he means by this? And what I noticed some people were doing is turning them into evaluative questions. Like, what do you think about what he says? And what happens unintentionally when you do that is that you barely talk about what you think he actually means, and then you go on to critique it. And what that does is it prevents you from forcing yourself to think more deeply about what he's actually saying. So if the question is, is he really saying don't do anything, or is he actually saying something else? And you say, well, Lao Tzu says we shouldn't do anything, and I think that's wrong. You've missed the opportunity to push yourself to think more deeply. Another pointer is that I noticed that some people had a tendency to be pretty vague with some of their answers, right? So it was like, if the question was, if human nature is positive, why do we still have problems? And people would say like, human nature's good, yet there are still problems because the world is not perfect or because we're the root of the problem. And it's like, okay, but go further than that, be more specific than that. Tell me what you mean. In what way is there an issue? So really try to be concrete and specific, and that'll allow you to get more detailed and therefore more complex. So avoid being overly general, I think, is a takeaway. The big thing, the final big thing is try to support your ideas with evidence. And I think there's almost a correlation here that like the people who had quotes that they mentioned in their posts, I thought tended to have more complex interpretations of what was going on because they were actually digging in and finding text to support those. So here you did a good job with this. Oliver did a good job with this. Many of you did a good job with this, but it's a good tip for all of you to be thinking of going forward. Okay, so as we go forward here, I want to just look at a couple of things. So these were the first two discussion questions, and I'm going to sort of tackle these together. So given that Lao Tzu has a very positive view of human nature, why are there still problems? How can a ruler impact these things? And then, this sort of ties into the next question in terms of how can a ruler impact things. So what should a ruler do? Does he really mean just do nothing, or does he mean something more than that? So let's look at some passages as a way to see if we can figure these out. So if you look at this batch of passages, and most of these were in the first PowerPoint, if you overvalue possessions, people begin to steal. The master leads by emptying people's minds and filling their cores, their bellies, meeting their basic needs by weakening their ambition. Throw away industry and profit, and there won't be any thieves. When there is no desire, all things are at peace. So there's a theme here, right? The theme, I think, is the case, is that the root of trouble is desire. Now, if Lao Tzu thinks that human nature is good, and we see desire as bad, that means something really important. Desire is not natural, or having an abundance of desires is not natural. That's something that's manufactured. And I'll give you an example, a modern example. Karl Marx in criticizing capitalism, says capitalists are like pimps. And the idea that he's getting at is that, like, what you do in the business of capitalism is you get people to want something, and then you sell them the thing that they now want. But they didn't even want it before. But you've generated the want in them, and then you say, oh, now that you need the newest iPhone, here's the newest iPhone. And so this idea of manufacturing desires. So that sort of helps us answer two discussion questions. The first is, why are there still problems? There's a lot of desires out there. What can a leader do? Reduce those desires. Figure out ways to get people to want less. Actually weaken ambition. And that sounds so weird to us, especially sort of very deep in the ethos of the United States of you should always want more, you should always try to achieve more, etc. But if you think about this idea, right, what happens with high ambitions? You get ego, you get greed, you get competition, you get conflict. What if people were content to simply have less? You can also think about environmental impact, that the more we want, right, the more we damage our environment and our world. If we could learn to want less, we'd be a lot better off. So the other thing that I think is interesting here comes into the style of leadership as well. When the Tao is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. The more prohibitions you have, the less virtuous people will be. So this seems like it's just about laying back as much as possible. But I think what is also maybe here is, like, the more controlling you are, that actually makes people less virtuous, because it's like you trust them less. Think of being a parent. If you have very strict rules, that might make your children want to rebel a lot. And if you trust your children more, they might be more trustworthy. Not always, right? And the idea, right, is that there's natural goodness, but look at the key word, forgotten. So there's a natural goodness, but it's easy to forget. And when we lose our way, then we need rules and norms and things to try to get us to act a certain way. But the key is there is a goodness, yet we've lost our way. Okay, a couple of other key passages I wanted to show you too that speak to this idea of what can a leader do besides try to not do too much. Here had a word stuck out to me in one of his responses, which is ego, sort of letting go of ego and being more humble, and leading as an example. And I believe Oliver made that point too. The master is content to serve as an example, content with an ordinary life. You can show all the people the way back to their own true nature. So this idea of leading by example is big. The idea of showing that you can be content with an ordinary life and be happy, that people then will try to recover that. And that's the way to teach people to have less desires. And then, of course, you've got the three key things he says towards the end: simplicity, patience, and compassion. And this is helpful because what that helps us understand is that it's not do nothing. It's just don't do too much. And then we're better off by working to reduce desires and by leading by example. So then finally, when it comes to the third discussion question, is he too naive? Is he relevant to today? I agree with you. It's hard to see examples in government, but I'd encourage you all to think about effective leadership by not being over controlling and trying to lead by example. You can maybe see this in some styles of coaching, teaching, parenting, leading a company. And then think about this other thing about, what if we did try to reduce desires? It probably would solve a lot of problems. So I maybe encourage you not to dismiss them too quickly, because it's about lessons we can learn, not can we just live just like Lao Tzu. All right, in general, good job. I enjoyed the discussion, and I'm looking forward to next week's.